Hey all, Andy Peloquin, dark epic fantasy author here. Everybody's spending so much time indoors, myself included. It's great to find ways to entertain ourselves, reading, writing. I'm sure y'all are looking for some great books. There are so many amazing stories out there to read, and I hope you consider mine as well. Today I'm going to be doing a little reading from The Silent Champions. This is basically sort of a Rainbow Six style um, epic fantasy company of soldiers where you've got your special operators, an archer for a sniper. You got heavy demolitions, but instead of demolitions, it's alchemy. Heavy gunner. You've got a guy with this massive battle axe. You've got your captain. You've got your rifleman. All these different characters. Your modern special ops style team, but in a fantasy world. So it's a super fun series. Very much Roman Legion style tactics versus giant barbarian Vikings. Hell of a story. I'll read you the opening scene of book one so you get a taste of it. Hopefully you enjoy this. Ambush! The cry from the rear of the Legion's column was drowned out by the thrum of 100 bowstrings being released. A moment later, a hail of arrows streaked from the thick trees bordering both sides of the East March Road. Captain Eravon acted on instinct honed over 15 years of drills and training. Sliding off his horse's back, he threw himself behind the nearest legionnaire in his shield. Something sliced the air a finger's breadth from Eravon's ear. The legionnaire in front of him grunted as an arrow punched into his back. Blood sprayed from his mouth as he grunted, gurgled, and collapsed at Eravon's side. Eravon fought down the instinctive horror and sorrow as the man slumped. Grieve later, he told himself, as the man, and so many more around him, fell to the hail of arrows. He ripped the shield from the dying legionnaire's grasp and stood in the first line. "Close up!" he shouted. His heart hammered in his chest, sweat soaked his palms, and his mouth had gone suddenly dry. Yet his training asserted itself in his mind, pushing back the icy fingers of panic. The Legionnaire's discipline kicked in before his order made it down the line. The 80 men still standing rushed to close ranks, forming a line 4 rows deep and 20 men long. Those in the front row presented shields to the enemy, while those behind angled their shields upward, like a tortoise's protective carapace, to ward off the plunging fire. Arrows rained all around him from east and west, clattering in a hailstorm against the Legionnaire's shield and armor, far too many finding Princelander flesh. The grunts, screams, and wails of wounded men filled the air, echoing in time with the unceasing thrumming of Erdkiller bowstrings. Arrows banged and clattered against the Legion's shields. All around him, the stink of nervous sweat thickened the air. Yet Eravon's men held firm, shields held fast, steel in their hearts. At the rear of the column, the shrill cries of terrified and dying draft animals filled the air. The armorless drivers of the company's baggage train were scythed down beneath the hail of arrows. One quick-witted cartman managed to scramble to safety beneath his cart, fear and horror twisting his bone-white face. A moment later, an arrow punched through the flank of one of his harnessed draft animals. The horse reared up, twisting in its traces, its shrieks of agony high-pitched and grating. Panicked by the smell of blood and the screams of its harness mate, the second horse reared as well and tried to bolt. The sudden movement snapped the wagon's front wheels and brought it crashing down with skull-crushing force atop the driver. Wood splintered and casks shattered on the paved stone, spilling gold, the Legion's pay, across the East March. The sight brought a renewed howl from the Erdkillers. A hand seized Eravon's collar and dragged him backward into the middle line. He immediately raised his shield, and the gap he'd left in the front line was filled by the soldier he'd replaced. "Good to see you made it, Captain," Lieutenant Nafe shouted into his ear. The man cradled his left arm against his chest, the broken-off shaft of an arrow still embedded in his forearm. "How bad is it, Lieutenant?" Eravon asked. The need to command, to keep a clear head and give commands to keep his men alive, was all that stopped the nervousness from overwhelming his mind. His soldiers counted on him, and he'd be damned if he let them down. Nafe looked down at the wound and shrugged. "Won't be playing the lyre any time soon, but I can still swing a sword." The cacophony of arrows clattering off the Legion's shields was occasionally interrupted by a grunt or cry as a missile found flesh. Men screamed in fail or snarled curses as they snapped off shafts stuck in their helmets, pauldrons, or shields. The hailstorm of shafts slowed and ceased, the sky brightening. The enemy had changed tactics. "Prepare for a charge!" Captain Eravon cried. He dropped his voice. "Looks like you'll get your chance," he told Nafe. Howls echoed through the forest around them, a fierce animal sound that chilled even Captain Eravon to the bone. He'd heard it before from across the battlefield, but never like this. Alone with his company, what remained of it, 20 miles from Anvil Garrison, the nearest Legion outpost. Just 6th Company against however many Erdkillers hid in the woods. His heart plummeted his scores, then hundreds of fur-clad barbarians burst from the dense tree cover. 7 feet tall, with long braided hair and beards that streamed in the wind, faces stained a hideous blue. Over their iron-studded leather vests, they wore the filthy, off-white pelts of wasteland ice bears. Their gut-twisting war chant filled the air. "Death to the half-men!" Words every legionnaire beside him had learned to fear. With the final howl, they raised their massive axes, clubs, and spears and charged. The enormous barbarians pounded across the cleared space between the East March Road and the forest, a wall of steel and death that closed the distance in seconds. Erevan leaned into his shield, the wooden steel strong against his shoulder, the grip of his sword solid in his hand. His teeth gritted, and he prepared for impact. Boom! 100 simultaneous clashes echoed up and down the Legion line as the Arid Killers struck. Steel and fur-covered flesh slammed into Legion's shields, and the foremost rank of legionnaires was hurled backward beneath the impact of huge bodies. Even with the middle ranks to brace them, the force of the charging barbarians was too much for their thinned lines to absorb. Soldiers slipped on ground made slick by the blood of their fallen comrades. The front rank struggled to repel the enemy, stabbing their short swords between their shields. The men in the second rank used their short spears to bite back at the enemies locked with their comrades, filling the gaps as more legionnaires fell. One, just in front of the captain's position, stumbled as a barbarian club smashed into his rectangular shield and drove the steel rim into his face. He slammed into the man behind him, and an Arid Killer rushed into the gap. A legionnaire in the second rank thrust between the shields to chop at the barbarian's knees. The huge man fell, and the legionnaire beside the captain finished the fallen savage with a quick stab of his spear. The grim song of battle filled the air. Legionnaires screamed, cried, and cursed. Steel clashed with iron and wood. The howling of the Arid Killers added an otherworldly, inhuman dissonance to the symphony of death. Captain Erevan gripped his short sword in sweaty palms, fought against the burning ache in his left arm and shoulder. The shield suddenly seemed an immense weight, yet the only thing that stood between life and death. His breath came so fast it felt he couldn't fill his lungs before the air exploded from his lips. In that instant, the clash of weapons on shields, the thumps of weapons striking flesh, the crack of shattered shields and bones, the screams of the wounded and dying filled his world. He could see nothing but the barbarians howling in front of him, hurling themselves at his men, snarling guttural curses in their desire to slaughter every legionnaire. Erevan was barely aware of Lieutenant Nafe on his left, Sergeant Byton on his right, and Corporal Older immediately before him. With effort, he pulled himself back from the narrowing battle vision, forced himself to scan the foremost ranks between him and the barbarian. They were being hammered by the Arid Killers, yet managed to hold their ground. But with the attack coming from both sides of the road, their lines were stretched dangerously thin. 2 rows of desperate, hemmed-in legionnaires were all that stood between him and the Arid Killers. Then the legionnaire in front of Corporal Older screamed and staggered backward, his face shredded by an Arid Killer's spear. Blood spattered Erevan's face, neck, and hands as the soldier sagged. Crimson soaked the man's burnished breastplate, and his collapsing weight bore down the man behind him. For an instant, a gap opened in the ranks. The legionnaires hurried to reform, close the opening before the enemy punched through. Too late. A massive Arid Killer barreled his way through the lines, whirling his axe about like a hurricane of steel and death. He brought the double-headed blade crashing onto the nearest legionnaire's shield. The metal rim bent, wood splintered, and the impact hurled the man into the soldier at his side. The whirling Arid Killer swung his axe around in a devastating blow that sheared through the man's neck and sent a Legion-helmeted head flying. Erevan flinched as more blood sprayed hot and warm along his upraised sword arm, dripping down his helmet into his face. Yet he drove his short sword into the barbarian's exposed stomach. The Arid Killer fell with a scream, but the damage had been done. Howling in triumph, more Arid Killers drove into the gap. Legionnaires fell back before the savagery of the attack. Many fell, never to rise again. Erevan scooped up a shield and pressed forward into the breach. He found himself face to face with a huge barbarian. Though he wore the same leather tunic, mail shirt, and steel skullcap as his comrades, he stood apart. Not just his long, braided blonde beard and his eyes, an azure deeper and harder than his blue-stained face. He stood taller than the rest, the breadth of his shoulders hulking. And instead of the dirty white ice bear pelt worn by all the other Arid Killers, his fur cloak had been dyed a deep red. Dyed, or stained with blood. With the howl, the blue-painted barbarian raised an enormous club overhead and brought it crashing down. Captain Erevan tried to dodge, but the legionnaires pressed too close on either side. He could do nothing but raise the shield. Agony seared through Erevan's arm, spiking from wrist to elbow as the blow splintered the shield and shattered his elbow. Crying out, Erevan fell back, barely retaining a grip on his sword. The barbarian loomed over him, raising the club once more. For an agonizing heartbeat, pain rendered Erevan helpless. He could do nothing but stare his sneering, blue-painted death in the pitiless face. Then Lieutenant Naif materialized beside him. The legionnaire shoved Erevan backward and drove his sword into the enormous barbarian's side. Chainmail links parted beneath the blade's razor tip. With a growl, Lieutenant Naif buried his short sword to the hilt. The Erdkiller's howl turned to a cry of horrible agony. His club fell from his fingers, and he clamped his hands over the blood gushing from the wound. Lieutenant Naif tried in vain to twist his sword free. After a moment of struggle, he released his grip on the hilt and drove a dagger into the barbarian's eye. All around them, the line buckled beneath the onslaught, and the barbarians charged into the gaps. Legionnaires fell beneath the stampede. Try as they might to hold their formation, they couldn't stem the tide of Erdkillers. Lieutenant Naif turned to Erevan. "We've got to break for—" An Erdkiller's spear cut off his words. The 2-foot blade punched through the back of his head, the tip driving out his neck, spraying blood over Erevan. Spine severed, Naif sagged like a dropped sack of rocks, his body clattering on the stony east march. No! Horror and fury surged within Erevan, a fire that burned in his belly and drove him to fight. He lashed out at the spear-wielding barbarian, his short sword shearing through the man's wrist. The Erdkiller stared stupidly at the blood gushing from the stump of his right arm. A vicious slash of Erevan's heavy blade opened his throat. Every movement sent pain flaring up and down his shattered arm, but he couldn't let his men fight and die alone. Gritting his teeth, he sought his next opponent. He would kill until the Erdkillers laid him low. He'd fight until his last breath, give every drop of blood to protect his men. Yet the state of 6th Company filled him with alarm. The Erdkillers had broken their ranks. All around him, legionnaires fought the massive barbarians in squads of 3s and 4s, back to back. Their faces bore the expressions of true fighting men, grim snarls, rictus grins of desperate terror, with a coldness that came with recognizing impending doom. They absorbed the battering of the Erdkillers' wrath on their heavy shields, returning the punishment with short swords and spears. In vain they attempted to reform ranks. Cold dread settled in Erevan's stomach. His men had no chance, yet their discipline held even in the face of annihilation. He had to find a way to turn the battle. If he could buy the legionnaires even a few moments, perhaps enough could escape. A desperate hope, but he had to try. His eyes locked on a tall, heavy-shouldered Erdkiller a short distance away. The barbarian's beard was shot through with gray, and yellowed bones hung among the leather-bound braids. Atop his dark blue tunic, the ice bear pelt slung over his shoulders had been dyed a deep crimson. He alone wielded a sword, a massive 2-handed weapon that far outweighed any legion shield. That has to be their leader. Erevan slipped between the knots of fighting men. He ducked a savage swipe of an axe and hamstrung the towering man, finishing him with a thrust to the throat. A club struck the ground a finger's breadth from him as he darted around an Erdkiller. The legionnaire next to him put a spear into the back of the barbarian's skull. Something slammed into Erevan, spinning him around. An arrow protruded from his right shoulder, and numbness coursed down his sword arm. Righting himself, he forced his feet to keep moving toward the leader. The huge barbarian held a bow easily 6 feet tall, made of wood as black as his vest. He had the string drawn back to his ear, an arrow nocked, the steel tip gleaming in the sunlight. The archer's eyes locked on Captain Erevan. The arrow came for him. A smirk twisted the Erdkiller's lips a moment before he released the string. Erevan tried to throw himself out of the way. Too slow. The arrow caught him in the left side, punching through chainmail, only stopping when it struck his backplate. Pain raced through his torso. The broad head had to have cracked a rib. He caught himself and stumbled onward. His left arm hung useless by his side, and every movement sent agony flaring through his ribs. But he'd somehow managed to retain his grip on his blade. He forced himself to raise his sword, though his right arm responded languidly. With mocking slowness, the Erdkiller drew another arrow from his quiver and set it to his bow. Ice seeped into Erevan's spine. He couldn't tear his eyes from the wicked steel point aimed at him. Every muscle in his body tensed in expectation of the impending agony. Yet he poured strength into his legs to cover the distance before the string twanged. A dark streak hurtled toward him and punched through his right thigh. The impact tore his legs from beneath him. He screamed as he landed on his shattered left arm. He tried to struggle upright, but an immense bulk collapsed atop him. His head rang, blood filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. His arms refused to cooperate, refused to heed his commands to get up. He had to get up, had to stand and fight beside his men. A tingling numbness spread through his limbs. Shadows hovered on the edge of his vision. The pounding of his heart sounded like a torrent in his ears. Have to fight. His struggles weakened, exhaustion claiming him. His determination drowned beneath the pain. Like a man sucked beneath quicksand, Erevan succumbed to agony and blood loss. And that's the end of the opening scene. Definitely not the end of the chapter. But basically, Captain loses his whole company in that ambush, and his shield arm got shattered. So now he can't hold the shield, which in sort of a Roman-style legion is like, what is he going to do? So he finds himself in this situation where he has to adapt new fighting style and new tactics to take on this enemy that has been giving them hell, essentially, and been fighting them to a standstill. So it is one hell of an action-packed epic series that you're going to love. Give it a try. If you love the Bridge Burners from Malazan, you like the Glenn Cook's Black Company, pretty much any book about that sort of Band of Brothers style unit, you're going to love The Silent Champions. Have a great day, and good luck.